Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where the true horror is having 107 tabs open on your browser. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. We're currently in the last stretch of a fourth series of the show where we're looking at teen horror movies in depth and discussing why teenagers, and very often teenage girls, make some of the most compelling protagonists and villains of the genre. Last week, we entered a new, weirder, more art housey space for teen horror with David Robert Mitchell's It Follows. And this week, we take on a double bill of films that are lesser known, perhaps less ambitious, but that both take on the big bad that is the internet. Both of the films discussed in this episode tackle the intersection of internet and horror aesthetics. Unfriended, which is a desktop horror where the action happens entirely through the screen and Skype conversations. And our second film, #horror, is an eerie teen girl sleepover party which is overlaid with extremely poppy and over-the-top social media graphics. They're both unhinged in their own very particular ways. And joining me to discuss the absolutely demonically mean teenagers of both of these films, and for the first time on the podcast, is researcher and podcaster Megan Allen. A quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK, and if you can't spare a few seconds of your day, please leave the podcast a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps the show and it helps my self-esteem. If you're new to the show, please keep in mind that we talk spoilers pretty much from the very beginning. And with all of that said, please enjoy our takes on Unfriended and #horror. Megan, welcome onto the podcast. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you so much for having me be here. I am super thrilled.
I'm very excited. I was very taken with you when we met doing a panel at the BFI, and I instantly thought we have to have a conversation in a recorded fashion through a, recording interface, which is the clunkiest way I've ever said I have to get this woman on the podcast.
Thank you. I was super flattered, especially being like a follower of the Final Girls, like collaborative, both the film journal and the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
Not listened to all the episodes, but I've listened to them and really enjoy them. So, I hope I didn't seem too crazy when you asked, and I was just like, yes, like super fast.
Only in the best way. Also, I deeply appreciated the fact that you, for this panel, had your copy of Men, Women, and Chainsaws with like little sticky notes, which is exactly how I also have all my reference books.
I felt like such a geek, but I was like, I'm also just going to lean into the fact that I'm a PhD researcher in this panel, so it felt like on brand.
So tell us a little bit about what you do around horror. You're writing your PhD right now on horror TV?
Horror kind of TV and film. I guess there will be potentially some literature in there. I'm in my second year of my PhD at the University of Manchester, and I'm in English literature, and I'm technically in medieval studies. And I am currently looking or investigating the connections between virgin murders, specifically female virgin murders, and the threads of like torment and pain and like blood throughout the centuries into contemporary horrors, and especially the final girl trope. So I'm currently working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Saint Margaret of Antioch, who is 4th century virgin murder. She's, quite legendary and apocryphal in a way, but she is known as the Demon Slayer, fought some demons, burst out of a dragon, and I'm looking at the relationship of, like, sacrifice and violence and pain and how women's bodies especially are used to tell these stories, whereas for men throughout from the Middle Times till now, it's been a lot more about, I don't know, their spirituality or their loquaciousness or something. But for women, it's always marked on the body. And so, yeah, I'm just like, why? Why do we like watching women suffer? Like, what does it do? What does it mean?
It sounds amazingly interesting. And tell me a little bit, like, what is your personal relationship with horror?
It's kind of funny. I have not always been a horror person.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually a quite scared little child in regards to horror. I had this fear until I was like 10 or so. It's kind of embarrassing, but I was just convinced I was gonna either get abducted by aliens or possessed by the devil. I guess I had just seen and heard somehow that if you show fear, you're like more easily possessed by the devil. So I used to like stare at myself in the mirror and go, "You are not afraid."
Oh my God.
So I guess like possession's always been a theme in my life. And I remember like over Christmas when I had to be like 5, my dad made me watch the famous pea soup scene, and that, like, from The Exorcist, and that kind of freaked me the fuck out. I look back in hindsight and I see he was doing it. It wasn't being mean, but it just really stuck with me. And yeah, so horror, I mean, the first horror film I can like recall watching that was definitely horror was The Haunting in Connecticut. Gosh, 10 plus years ago. I actually just recently rewatched it and I felt like it held up pretty well, all things considered. And that movie scared the living daylights out of me. And of course I showed up at home and told my mom that that's what we watched. And she was like, "You know, our house is haunted, right?" So naturally didn't sleep for 2 weeks. But yeah, like my current love for horror and everything really, it sounds silly, but it blossomed during the pandemic. I don't know.
Interesting.
I had started to enjoy it more, but during the pandemic, I had to have watched over 50 films. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Also, The Haunting of Hill House by Mike Flanagan on Netflix, which was like, a year or two before, but that was a really crucial, I think, reintroduction to the horror genre for me.
God, that's kind of an amazing personal journey. I feel like this is why I like asking people this question, because everybody has their own horror origin story. They always have kind of their horror coming out story as well, in a sense where it feels like such a often a taboo genre where you almost don't want to tell people that you like that stuff, because I mean, at least this has been my experience. They always kind of ask you, "What's wrong with you? Why do you like being scared? Why do you enjoy this, watching this stuff?" Which weirdly never happens with grislier genres like true crime. I think true crime is much more morally murky and usually grislier in terms of what they're actually talking about and showing. But somehow that evades that sort of questioning. But I love that the pandemic has kind of brought it out from all of us.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a symptom or an example, if you will, of the highbrow versus lowbrow culture. And horror, I think, has historically kind of been branded as low culture, with like the Penny Dreadfuls and everything. And it's very sensational. And we talked about this at the BFI panel, but I think it's only in their last couple decades where it's really started to prove itself, I guess, to the general populace that it's not just campy and ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, it's very true as well. Like, I saw that you covered Slumber Party Massacre in this teen series, and I was like, this is one of my all-time. I love a good splatter film, and I was like, this one is just, it's so fun and so ridiculous, and the poor pizza boy. Love it.
Still one of one of the funniest slashers ever, and I don't think it gets enough credit for being as funny as it actually is.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, even in like Men, Women, and Chainsaws, it's very much like, oh, it's a phallic imagery sort of thing. And it's like, okay, yeah, very true. But it was also directed by a woman, and didn't she like write or executive produce it or something? So there's something else there that is.
It's one of the only. I think it's still perhaps the only slasher franchise. Franchise is a strong word, but there were 3 films made in the franchise, and then there's a remake last year. They were all always written and directed by women.
Okay. I did not know that about all. Yeah, I think there's just something really special there. And I think it adds to the comedy of it, at least in the first one, which is the original, which is the only one I've seen.
I definitely don't encourage the other ones, to be fair.
Yeah, and I've tiptoed back and forth with the remake. I'm like, I don't know. I don't want it to taint how glorious the original is.
So in this series, I'm tackling teen horror. So I guess my first question to you is, before we really get into the 2 films that we're going to be discussing in this episode, Unfriended and #horror, a title that will get very old very quickly throughout this conversation. What is your general opinion on teen horror? Is that a subgenre that you enjoy, that you gravitate towards?
Yeah, so I had to think about this and think like, okay, well, what is teen horror? Because it's such a large subgenre of the horror milieu or whatever, you know? And, but obviously, first thing that comes to mind is Scream. I mean, it is, I think it's just the defining horror film. It's the best all around. And I was kind of like, oh, a lot of them are very just teen or young adult centric. I guess the question is like, when does being a teenager stop and start? And I think like with #horror, it was very telling that they were 7th graders or year 7. So what is that, like 12?
Yeah.
Which is potentially preteen, depending on what your definition of a teenager is and everything, and if preteenhood even is a thing that exists.
Well, this has been a really interesting thing to tackle, even in the choices. So I think I might have mentioned it before, but I unfortunately love giving myself extra work for the purposes of a joke, and I wanted to start the season in September and end it in June, like a school year would, which I both enjoy and chuckle, and also kind of hate myself for giving myself so much work. But as I kind of revisited all these films, this whole like, when does teenhood stop and start with these films becomes really interesting, because a lot of the films, like, sometimes they're in their first or sophomore years of university, of college. Sometimes they're kind of not specifically coded as teenagers. They're just general young people. But the influence of their films and the way that they're shown is kind of like they're just generic young, which in horror often equates with like teenagers. And then sometimes they're in high school, but their high school environment just doesn't really play into the story at all. So it's been really fun kind of expanding it a little bit, because there's straight up things like Halloween, where it's a high school film, but the high school isn't really involved, and all the protagonists look in their 20s, but technically they're teenagers.
Right.
And then, wider things like the granddaddies of slasher films. So like, you've mostly influenced high school slashers, but the people in the films are not necessarily coded as teenagers. So I've kind of kept it very fluid. Generic young people, and sometimes preteens, and sometimes clearly teenagers. But oftentimes they're also played by 27-year-old actors. So the lines are always very blurred, except here where they're clearly played by teenage actresses.
Unfriended is obviously a little bit more in that kind of, they're coded as being juniors or seniors in high school, but
yeah.
Some of the actors are a little bit older and some of them are spot on. But yeah, #horror, it's like undeniable that they are in what we call in America middle school. So yeah, like year 7, just before everything goes to shit with hormones and all that kind of stuff. Like it's starting, but it hasn't officially erupted yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting, that you mentioned that like around this time, so this is already the 2010s. Unfriended comes out in 2014 and hashtag horror comes out in 2015. Like this is also a moment where teenage girls specifically kind of start behaving or becoming teenagers a lot earlier in a way. And there's a few films around the late 2000s, I think, that really start to tap into this vibe of these are very, preteen girls who are mimicking behavior so much older teenage girls, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hashtag horror definitely had the queen bee kind of Heathers-y vibe to it of alpha female and you'll do what I want. It kind of started to spin that on its head a little bit at the end, but I don't know. It's not the best film. I know we'll get there later, but I have been thinking about it more than I thought that I would have. And yeah, it was horrifying in more ways than just like horror. I was like, I'm having flashbacks to Abercrombie and Fitch wearing days, and I don't really want this.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Megan.
It's okay.
I think this happened with Mary Wild on another episode with when we were talking about excision and warm bodies. So like, I really don't mean to create existential crises for my guests, but unfortunately it keeps happening. So I can only lead into it. So
that's fine.
So let's start diving into the first one of the films that we're going to be chatting about, Unfriended from 2014. So for the purposes of anyone who might not have revisited this film very recently, can you summarize the plot of Unfriended for us briefly?
Yeah, so just to start off, the whole film takes place on like a computer screen recording. So, it's like clicking open of windows and messaging and everything. And I think this was like the first, at least horror film to really take advantage of that. And now it just feels so, it's interesting because I had never seen Unfriended until now, and just how kind of natural that felt because of the pandemic. So I wonder, I'll have to ask post my description if you have any kind of shifting relationships with that. But yeah, so group of, 4 or 5 friends get in a video chat, I guess after school later that day, because that's what you do when you're in high school. And so we have the film opens with this high school student, Laura Barnes, committing suicide by shooting herself in the face on campus. And it's a year later. And so this follows the storyline of these group of friends, Jess, Ken, Adam, Blair, and Mitch. And they get hacked, air quotes, I guess, or I don't know if there's another way to describe it, by an unknown user, a ghost user, if you will, known as Billy227. And it kind of turns out that this Billy227 is like the vessel or whatever for the past Laura Barnes, who starts, playing games with them, and bad things start happening, meaning that they all start to die in really creative ways for their repercussions and their involvement of posting the video that propelled or catalyzed Laura to kill herself due to online bullying, I guess. Yeah, I'm done with that. Sorry, that was not the most coherent one.
Do you know what? Summarizing a film is surprisingly hard, which is, to be totally transparent, is exactly why I asked my guests to do it. It's because it's really freaking hard, and I'd rather not do it.
There's just like so many moving parts. I'm like, well, we're going to get to the point, where we talk about how they die and all the things. So like, does it do to dwell on that now? Or like, does it matter that Blair and Mitch are together? Or like, it's just, yeah.
I think the clear thing that we have to start with is the fact that it is a desktop horror. So it's a kind of one of the first examples. It isn't the first one, but it's one of the first examples of this sort of new mode of making filmmaking, basically of filmmaking made entirely on a desktop. So we never actually leave what the characters are seeing through their computer, and specifically just one character. But there is a lot of multitasking, which is exactly what we usually do in our kind of daily use of screens anyway. And increasingly so. So I kind of wanted to ask you kind of how well or not do you think the use of the desktop and the moving bits and pieces and the chats and the Facebook and the Skype and all these things work for the tension of the film?
I think that I thought that some like the Facebook scenes and whatnot were more successful than others, but I found that like the messaging between especially Blair and Mitch, you know, and the kind of like, why aren't you responding sort of thing, or all that, and, you know, losing the focus of the Zoom conversation because you're messaging somebody. I thought that was very successful and relatable, at least on my behalf, because been there, done that. I also think that the opening up of the tabs and checking those while people were talking, or that were like third hand removed, right? Because Mitch mentioned something in a message, and then so we're not even like looking at the screen with the friends talking on it, and now you're on some random website. I also thought that was quite successful, though I think one of the major cons of this style of filmmaking is that if you don't have the benefit of watching it like on a cinema screen, sometimes you can't really see what they're typing. And like I watched it on my television at home, which isn't huge, but I was kind of like, oh, what exactly is being typed there or said or researched? And most of the time they were good about it then, like, you know, going into the message feed and getting larger. But there were a few I just missed and wasn't able to process. So yeah, I mean, I think it was stressful too, just because she had so many screens open, and that generally tends to stress me out. But that's also just a personal response to that, I think.
It is really strange because I'd seen this film before, and the first time I saw it, I watched it on a laptop, and I've always kind of been fascinated by desktop filmmaking in general, desktop documentaries, anything that kind of use the interfaces of our daily usage, I guess, and social media, and tries to transform that into narrative language, or to tell a story. I find really interesting, and very few of them have been successful. Obviously, Host was one of the greatest examples last year. Well, actually, 2020 now.
Yeah, I know.
And it's one of the interesting things is that it really ages. Like, it so belongs in a particular era. So even when I rewatched it today, when they started just using Skype to hang out and this very, you know, mid 2010s interface of a Mac computer, it looked so dated. It looked so specific to a particular era, or the use, like teenagers using Facebook seems like a complete contradiction in terms right now because of how it's evolved. So I do love these films, especially because how they capture a particular moment in time. And some of them do feel hokey. I don't think this one feels as hokey to me as others. You know, the way that they're typing, the way that they talk to each other, the way that they kind of you know, don't capitalize things, or the way that they go between even the little bookmarks that are seen on their browser. It's like Tumblr and Jezebel and like those sites that feel also particularly of that era.
Yeah, should Forever 21.
Yes.
RIP is one.
Like those things really work because they're such records of a particular time.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I definitely noticed the interface thing as well, like that mid 2000s Mac interface and the old message bubbles and everything like that. And I don't know, it still it works because I think it kind of gives you a little bit of that displacement, you know, to kind of settle into it more, if that makes sense. Where part of what made Host so fucking scary, aside from just its timing and how well it was done, but it just felt too real. You're like, this looks exactly like what my screen looks like.
Yes.
What if?
Exactly.
I mean, I'm not planning on manifesting any vengeful spirits, but
you never know, though.
You never know. Might get bored on like a Thursday night.
And what do you make of this conceit, which is not dissimilar, I guess, to the Host one, of like there's this conversation and the technology, the browsing, which is very basic tech anyway, in the sense that it's just browsing, it's chatting, and it's, you know, looking at YouTube videos and checking Facebook. This is infiltrated by the ghost of a teenage girl who had committed suicide a year before. And we only see her through videos of her and text and her Facebook profile. But she is the ghost in this film. It is essentially a ghost film. So what do you make of Laura Barnes as a character that we never actually get to see?
I mean, I think that Laura definitely had some unintentionally hokey bits. I kept wondering if the name like Billy 227 was a reference to Billy Loomis, and then like, you want to play a game, you know, kind of thing. I was like, are these like really tiny nudges, or is it just because like I'm obsessed with Scream, so I just want to see it everywhere because I love it. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations where it's a good, I think that Laura, like the concept of Laura hacking in and causing all these truths to be exposed was really useful. But also I got like really lost, to be quite fair, on how some of the tech stuff was working. Like when they use the program to wipe their computers or whatever, so that Billy 227's not in the chat anymore, but then Billy calls, or Laura, I should say, calls on the phone and then is able to get back into the system. And I was like, is that because it's connected to the internet, like old school landline, or what's happening? And was there a camera in, not Adam, Blender Hands.
Yes, I know that guy. Ken. Because
Kennington was his name, yeah. Like in the Skype. Sorry, continue. What were you going to say?
What I was going to say is that actually they're not as memorable. I think this is one of the things that is very difficult to pull off with these types of films, which again Host and Searching, which is sort of from the same group of filmmakers, but stars John Cho, and John Cho is obviously very charismatic, very good actor. When there's a group, it is really difficult, I think, to give them all a personality, because they did end up I had to remind myself, and I was very grateful that they had little names underneath their windows on the Skype. I was like, which one are you again? What did you do? Because they don't have that much of character development. Yeah, I think that for me, the largest character development, or the ones I was able to like get a grasp for the most, were Blair, who's like our main protagonist, right? Mitch and Adam. I think just because they were the most involved and like loud, and maybe it's also because they had like the love triangle-y thing. I mean, that, because when Val dies, I was like, what? I don't even understand, what does she do? And it wasn't until later I found out that she had drank the bleach that caused the seizure. I was like, I just missed that. And yeah, Kennington was just kind of there as like the tech nerd guy.
I guess. Didn't really offer anything, though. I mean, I wasn't expecting his hands and arms and I guess face to go into the blender. So that definitely like tickled my yes, like absurd death bone, because I do love those. They make me very happy. Not in a creepy way. Like creepy but not creepy. If you
will. You're allowed to be creepy and mean on this podcast. That's kind of the thing.
Yeah, I guess I don't mean it in like a sociopathic way, but I love the more absurd and like gruesome a death is, like the happier I am. Like quick side note, I saw the Foo Fighters film when it came out at the end of February with my partner, and there were only like 5 other people in the theater. Like no one went to go see that.
Yep.
And spoiler, there's a scene where 2 characters are, you know, starting to get into like sexy time, get it on. And Dave Grohl's possessed by the evil spirit at this point. He's under the bed with a chainsaw. And there's just a shot, like an eagle eye shot. And the chainsaw just goes through both the lovemaking characters' foreheads. And then he just splits them in half. And their bodies like split apart. And it's just so intense and over the top. And I laughed with glee so loud. And I'm pretty sure I upset everyone else in the theater, excluding my partner, who I think was laughing at me because of the pure joy that I had.
I mean, you're kind of almost convincing me to watch that film.
It was much better than I anticipated, and it's also a good way to, you know, give an homage and, like, memory of the Foo Fighters drummer who just recently passed.
Yeah, Taylor Hawkins.
But yeah, so sorry, back to Unfriended.
Yeah.
I don't know, I found like the deaths, very underwhelming, but also like creative. Just like Jess, played by Renee Olstead, her death with a curling iron shoved down her throat.
Yes.
I was like, what? That's intense.
That was
But it does
good.
kind of like happen, and then you kind of move on.
Yeah. What did you think? Because I'll tell you the one that worked for me the best, which is probably the most subtle one. And I love a bit of gore, but I'm not necessarily a gore hound. I prefer the brand of scares where it's like you kind of have to look for it, and then when you find it, it really enhances the creepiness. So my favorite was the first kill, where there was just this static shot of the girl who's looking straight at the webcam, and everyone else is moving, and you're kind of comfortable because we're used to images freezing when we're video calling someone, but her phone, as they call her, is vibrating on her table and it starts moving, and you just see the phone enter the frame on the side, but she still looks like a completely static glitchy image of her. And that I found really creepy. It's like the first kill that happens, and it's the first one that starts getting into the gorier as opposed to spookier territory. And then, they keep doing this sort of glitch image of something horrific happening, glitch, another image of something horrific happening. And did that glitchiness work for you?
To be quite honest, I didn't think too much of it, so I'm gonna say yes. Like, it didn't frustrate me. I mean, I bet that if I were to like pay attention more critically, because again, since this was my first one, I was like trying to take notes and watch it and like be present. But I think that the glitching, it's just kind of like in other horror films where the lights are flashing on and off or something. It's just a way to enable that kind of strobe light effect where you don't know where that object or person is going to be in the next instant or next non-glitchy bit. I mean, now that I think about it, it was kind of used for all of them, but like for Ken's death, I thought that worked, where they're like, what's happening? And then all of a sudden you just hear like his hands like in the blender, and it's only like 2 or 3 seconds and then it's over. and he, gets wiped off the chat. So, but it's also like, how else would you? I don't know. Yeah, it is interesting because I think the glitchiness goes with the multitasking aspect of it, the kind of constant frame changing and minimizing and maximizing. So maybe that's why I didn't notice it as much as perhaps if it was done in a not desktop horror. But
and what did you make of the ending? Well, and when I say the ending, I kind of also want to talk about the leading up to it, the moment where they've kind of all accepted that this is Laura's ghost, and she's sort of egging them on to reveal deeply uncomfortable truths about everyone, and kind of getting to the ending with Blair and the revelation about Blair. What did you make about that whole like process, and how Blair ends up being the survivor, but also ultimately kind of the villain of the whole story?
Yeah. I mean, the moment that she typed "we're good people" in on Facebook, I was like, oh no, shit's gonna hit the fan. Never say that. That's a lie that people like to tell themselves.
Good people never type that.
Yeah. That was just really stressful for me because I don't like conflict. And so when Adam and Mitch were like screaming at one another, I was like, you both just need to take a deep breath and calm down so that you can use your words. That's just like how I was feeling on the inside. I think that one did work for me because at this point I feel that that's when everything started to spiral out of control, and this kind of vengeance mission of the ghost, when everything starts to spiral out of control, so Mitch and Adam are like screaming at one another. Jess and Blair are like, because Jess is still alive at this point, isn't she? Yeah, because she's the one that like defaced the grave and everything. Or they're both like crying, and yeah, just things start to spiral, and so do the like revelations and Never Have I Ever. And I was like, this is going beyond just like, what is the end game with this? Because once we start finding out that like Adam roofied a girl, raped her, got her pregnant, and forced her to have an abortion, I was like, this is fucked, man. Like that honestly is worse, I think, than the ultimate revelation that Blair was the recorder of the video that was posted that ultimately led to Laura killing herself, which is just her passed out at a party and she's shat herself. Like, I don't know. That's like a revelation. It's kind of like, oh, okay. Kind of makes sense to why Blair was the final one. Why Blair was like the main contact for Laura. But at the same time, to me, that just doesn't equate to someone being like drugged and raped and violated that way. I guess it didn't lead to like death that we know of. And so I thought that was just kind of, things started to get really topsy-turvy and disproportionately balanced to me at that point. But I think also you're kind of like, what is going to happen? Like with the printouts between Blair and Adam, which basically says like, if you show this on the screen, the other person will die. And I don't know if that was meant to be like slightly redeeming on Adam's part, even though we just found out he's a rapist, because he doesn't show it, or to also show the potential of villainy in Blair, because she does show it because Mitch is freaking out and then Adam shoots himself with the gun. Wow, like just thinking about this, and poor audience, because there is just like a lot that happens there that's chaos.
It is purely chaotic, and I think, I don't know, one of the interesting things about rewatching it and rewatching in the context of the season is actually, I don't think this is a film that actually gets teens that well, because it has gone full extreme. It has gone when they get shit-faced and pass out at a party, it's like the most extremely humiliating aspect of it. They're recorded with shit on them, passed out in the middle of a garden, and everybody, and the consequence of that is the girl commits suicide because of the intensity of the humiliation. When they're talking about every single one of these groups of friends, of people, has done something heinous, but not heinous in a teenager way, heinous in a like extreme soap operatic way. So I think there's that element. I don't know if it's sort of teen phobic in a way, where they kind of think it's kind of taking this approach of kids these days are just completely unhinged and wild, and the internet has made them callous sociopaths.
I don't know. I do think that it is a very like teens, they're so addicted to their screens, and just have like lost contact with reality in a way, and do these horrible things. And for me, it's like, okay, someone being filmed, passed out, shot yourself, posted on the internet, it's mortifying, for sure. But their whole, like, people were like, you should just kill yourself, and da-da-da. That felt very kind of naive, almost like 1980s character, where you're like, that's comical, though. Some people might be assholes and say that, but there's always going to be another thing that moves on. Like, that's like, oh, did you hear about this? And so I found that interesting. And just the out of controlness, again, like referring to the Adam character. At first, they're like, never have I ever's were relatively, I think, in line with like what a teenager of their age would be like. Having sex with another person, but I really love you, like that, or doing something stupid like defacing a grave. The car crashing thing, I was like, I'm going to run with this, but insurance and stuff is involved, so that just wouldn't happen. Sounds so old, but like, it just, that would have been different. And then, then you get into the, what was it? I've never stolen $800 from Adam, and Jess was like, you have all this money. And I was like, what the fuck? Who just takes, like, what teenager just steals money from your friend like that? I don't know, maybe, people, I was like, this is beyond reality.
But also,
and then it gets,
what random teenager just has like $800 on their person?
I don't know, but I want to be them as a not teenager now and have that much money.
So go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I didn't really have a thought, so.
I wanted to ask you, kind of before we move on to #horror, is how do you, obviously it feels dated, but how do you feel this film has aged, considering how our relationship with, technology and social media has changed and evolved?
So in regards to like interfaces and some of the platforms being used, like you mentioned earlier in this episode, is very dated. It's very time capsule-y. Like, oh, remember when we used Facebook to message? Just like for me with middle school, within #horror, even though they're like messaging on these platforms, I'm like, I remember AOL Messenger, like instant messenger, being the thing, and talk about like an archaic platform. So there is that kind of nostalgic, but it wasn't intentionally nostalgic, but I think that it kind of, for those who are familiar, has a hint of that. I think that it was very of that moment where cyberbullying was also like a really big fucking deal.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been like those two major cyberbullying suicides that had occurred like within the year before. And I think they were in America that, you know, this had a direct kind of timestamp relationship to that is kind of lost now unless you're aware of that occurring at that time. I think that the addiction to screens aspect of it, and I was reading some just brief little blurbs on, well, why wouldn't they just leave the screen, or why wouldn't they just, turn it off? And it's like, well, they saw the consequences of what happens when you try to do that, so that's just dumb. But it's also the commentary on like you can't look away, but also that's the reality. Mm-hmm. When you're on those screens, that is what is real, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that still 100% translates today. Might manifest itself a little differently, but especially with the pandemic and how we chose to spend our time and the way that we had to communicate with others, like talking about host again, I think that just because of how history unfolded, it's a bit more relevant than it would have been had we not been in a pandemic for the past, 2+ years, forced to be on our screens to communicate with one another and kind of live that reality. That's a very long-winded, convoluted response, but that's what I'll run with.
No, it's a very considered one, and I think that's the kind of the bullying and obsessive nature of that kind of is a nice is a bad choice of words, is a segue into the next film we need to talk about, which is #horror, which came out the following year and is in many ways the polar opposite, but also a very good sister film to Unfriended, and it's much less known. And I've had a little bit of a thing for this film since it came out. So I was very, very keen to include it in this conversation. So can you briefly summarize #horror for me?
Yes. All right, I'll do my best. So there are like 6 very affluent teenage girls who are like in middle school, so year 7, year 8, so like around 12 years old, who I'm assuming it's like a Friday because they're in school uniforms, but they're going to a friend's house to have a sleepover, as you do at that age. But it kind of the way that they treat each other, which is very cruel and definitely has aspects of bullying, starts to have real life repercussions that become more sinister and violent. And then there's like a big reveal at the end because a running thread kind of throughout the film too that's going along with just, these girls dressing up and dancing and like, I'm going to post this on Instagram or whatever the platform is. I'm so cute. Which we've all been there. Mm-hmm. Guilty as charged. But there's also these shots of like, this one man in the opening scene, his throat's cut. And you're like, and that kind of keeps getting sprinkled alongside what's occurring with the girls, and there's shots of like looking in as if someone's watching, and so you kind of have this feeling of, oh, is it going to be like an invasion kind of film? Mm-hmm. And that it's not, but there's always that kind of tension of something occurring beneath the surface. And yeah, it ends with a bunch of dead girls and some distraught parents. And yeah, that's my kind of spoiler-free, but we'll get into it, synopsis. Basically a slumber party gone wrong, but not as fun as Slumber Party Massacre.
Those are both great. I love those. So you kind of really, really hit the nail on the head. The first thing to note about this film is that it's incredibly centered on very, very affluent preteen girls. So
like bizarrely affluent. Also, sorry, quick side note.
Yeah.
All the actresses are like fucking big time heiresses and stuff too. And like in the cast.
All the girls?
Not all the girls, but like the one girl who had one girl's played by Blue Lindeberg, whose family are like Swedish clothing conglomerate people who like did lines with clothing lines with like Justin Timberlake and stuff. Lydia Hearst is in it as the other woman with the dad who's like related to the Hearst family. Balthazar Getty of like the Getty art family is the dad that gets beheaded, and I was like, what is this film? Because then you also have like Natasha Lyonne, who's headlined in it, and she's only in it for less than 5 minutes. Same with Taryn Manning. And then you have Timothy Hutton, who I didn't just like, hey, it's Haunting of Hill House, Dad.
Yes.
So sorry, continue what you're going to say, but it's just kind of, I found it really interesting, like, because the house that they used, too, was, like, a friend's house.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like, a friend of a friend's house that the director was able to
Tara,
use.
Who is married, I think, to a pretty big artist in real life. She's an artist herself, and when I was looking at her biography, one of the things that kind of really stood out to me was that she lives in a house designed by an architect called Saul Harris Brown. I don't know my architects, but I think that if any Wikipedia page points out that you live in a house designed by any architect,
then big deal.
That's a very specific kind of person who buys that sort of property.
Yeah.
So my question really is, like, you're really right. Like, wealth is in the themes, in all the choices, in the setting, in the way that it's filmed, in the cast. And it feels, I don't know if you got the sense, maybe because we're all kind of culturally revisiting the noughties right now, which means, you know, kind of revisiting a lot of images that were very much the mainstream imagery when I was a teenager. And this very much feels like it's made by someone who, like, also had that imagery of kind of early millennial Paris Hilton style level of wealth. Like, just beyond anything that I've ever interacted with directly. So I wanted to ask you kind of, what do you make of the design of the film and how it depicts wealth without talking about it directly?
Yeah, I mean, it's very Gossip Girly for sure. Yeah, it's like, kind of use a personal anecdote. Like, for me growing up, I'm from Pasadena, California, and that's a very affluent community. And it has, I don't know if this still holds true, but it has the highest concentration of private schools, so like fancy ones that you pay to go to, in the world. Like within a certain area, like it's just, there's a lot of money there. So I grew up around a lot of very affluent people, but not as affluent as these girls. These are like, the Gossip Girl, almost like fairy tale wealthy, just stupid, out of this world, kind of, to the point where it becomes almost like tacky. I feel how much money there is. And like in this house, it has these, you know, beautiful floor to ceiling glass windows. It looks like almost one of just the walls of the house is made of glass. And there's artwork everywhere. And the daughter that lives there, she's like, it's like living in a museum. That's what my mom wanted it to be. So there's also this kind of, you can't even be comfortable in your own home because it's this curated and maintained space, which is a really interesting, I think, reflection of social media, right? Because that's a curated and maintained space. You don't put up the ugly triple chin photos usually on like an Instagram or something like that. You want the best angle and the best lighting, and so there's also, I think that kind of, without realizing it, adds to this sense of unease, at least as an older viewer watching, because it's kind of like, well, then where do you get to be yourself? And I think these girls, that's like one of the big kind of conflicts and the cause of a lot of their frustrations and animosity towards one another is, well, you don't understand, or you can't be like that, or, you know, the one poor girl, they're like, you're just too fat, just go eat in the corner, kind of thing. And yeah, I think that home and that kind of space and that the echelon of people that's a part of definitely is an influence in the film and its atmosphere without even necessarily being aware of it. That it definitely kind of sets up the story in a very particular way, which I guess is true of any sort of setting. That's why it's a setting.
And what do you make of the way that these girls interact with one another? Because even rewatching it, even it being kind of dated, even being in this very extremely obscenely wealthy and hyper curated setting, they are exceedingly cruel to each other.
Oh, yeah. It was like comedic how bad they were to one another. To me, like, I've never encountered someone behaving that way to someone else, like that continuously, and being that catty and that just cruel. Like, what group of, they just like kick out Kat, the one of the girls. She's like into the snow. They're home by themselves. Like, no, where's the next house? And they're just like, you need to leave. Like, what the fuck? And yeah, making fun of the Georgie because she's a bit overweight, and just being like, eat more food. Maybe you should do like a really easy dance class if you're gonna get back into dance, kind of thing. And it's just like, I would never speak to someone like that ever. So I think it kind of makes them all little villainesses, except for, you know, the one protagonist girl that we're supposed to have, Natasha Lyonne's daughter, but I can't remember what her actual name in the movie is. Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is like the least wealthy one of them.
Right. And she's like the new girl, the transfer, the kind of weird one that when she first gets there overhears them being like, why'd you even invite her? You know, kind of thing. I think she's also the actress that carried her cards closest to her chest in regards to, you know, she's like reveals for being 12 that she's like already had sex and everything, and the scars on her arms, and you're kind of like, how much of this is truth and how much of this is lies to manifest this persona of intrigue and like bad girlness. At least to me, that's how it read. I could have just totally missed the point on that, though. That happens.
I don't think you missed the point, but I did wonder kind of what was the point of #horror? Like, where is the horror actually located here? Because it's not so much in the kills.
Yeah, a lot of this happen off screen. Knowing like the origin story of this movie and how it's supposed to be cyberbullying is...
So for anyone who might not know, what is the origin story of the movie?
So the creator, Tara Subkoff, the writer and director, she was like talking to a friend's daughter, who I guess is around this age, and asked her like, what is the most terrifying or frightening thing to you? And she said cyberbullying. And so Subkoff like found that really like intriguing, and because of this idea of, well, it's out there and it's everywhere and it'll just follow you. Like, you can't necessarily escape it. You can if you disconnect, but I guess it can always, you know, that's like a theme right now in some movies, is it's like, don't Google the person because you might not like what you see. The cyberbullying aspect of it, to me, I thought it was just much more about like bullying as a whole. and like I guess that includes the cyberbullying aspect, but in regards to a point of the film, I don't know. Don't be a little bitch. Like I don't know. And by that, but by that I mean like they're just so cruel and horrible. And like yes, honesty is a good thing, but you need to have tact, and also just like don't always rely on your phone. Like I'm guilty of it, but it's not life. It's not everything, despite what it might make you feel. But yeah, I don't. Do you have any like thoughts on like what the purpose of this film is or was?
I'm just thinking, and like it does feel a little bit sort of mom-like in that sense of that sort of vibe of the teenage, again, same as with Unfriended, but kind of from a completely different perspective. The teenagers have gone wild. I want to show how deeply damaging social media has been on girl dynamics. And I think it's a little bit too much to blame just social media on it. Like, I don't think the dynamics between the girls, which are awful, they're all awful to each other, they're only exacerbated by this like fake social platform that they're using. But if that was taken away from them, they would still be just as awful. Yeah. They'd still be shaming each other, they'd still be bullying each other. And I think like that is more interesting than the way that it uses this pretend technology. And I think the point that the film wants to make is that social media has ruined childhoods and is forcing teenagers and especially girls to grow up a lot quicker. And, you know, it's not necessarily wrong, but I do think it's a little bit melodramatic in how it approaches it. Like, I think Kat from the very beginning is like a full-on sociopath in this movie.
Yeah.
Which I find her quite interesting because we don't usually get those types of characters, those kind of like almost incel-y type of characters being girls. But actually the point that I find more interesting of the film is just how awful they all are to each other and how they use, even when they're trying to be nice to one another, they can't. They literally cannot. Even when they're trying to be sweet to one another and comfort some Georgie or Sam, they're still absolute bitches to one another. So it never gets easier, and that I find like amazing about this film.
Yeah, well, and also just like parenting on the behalf of Chloe Sevigny's the mom, just like leaving them. Like, okay, she's going to a 12-step meeting, but yeah, she's like, I'll be gone an hour. She's clearly gone a lot longer than that, and just is like so disconnected. And like the only way she like relates to the girls is, you know, when she gives them the jewels, which were very gaudy and whatnot, and then she's like, oh, we can get pizza later. And then, of course, the girls were like, but carbs. And that's just very sad if little children can't enjoy pizza because they're missing out on some of the best happiness in life. But yeah, like just the absent parents as well. Dr. Cox turns out to be, or Dr. White, sorry, not Dr. Cox, Dr. White, so Timothy Hutton's character, so Kat's dad, you know, is at first portrayed as this very detached, you know, work-obsessed kind of father who's not there, and perhaps that was true, but then we find out that he has been trying to keep an eye on her and keep her in, and just failed at that. And yeah, he gets over the top and like kind of hits the girls at one point.
Oh, God.
And, like, is screaming at and terrifying them. And you're like, this isn't okay.
He is insane in this film.
Yeah. But at least he's trying to, like, knock some sense into them. Not, like, I'm not advocating screaming and violence or anything. But it was just nice to see someone being like, stop being self-centered little bitch girls. Like, your friend is out in the freezing cold because you kicked her out. Have you thought about that? You know, kind of thing. But yeah, he's obviously bonkers. Don't think maybe he should have died, but whatever. A horror film, right?
And like, that's kind of an interesting point that I want to talk about. Like, Kat's father is unhinged in this movie, but maybe this is also like an age thing. But a lot of the teen horror films that I've been talking about in the series, I'm almost more interested in the parents and sometimes the absence of parents as well. So what do you... And here they get quite a bit of space as well. What do you make of the adults in the movie?
Okay, so yeah. Daddy White is involved, but cuckoo. Kind of like Carrie White's mom. I wonder if White was or if it's just because, like, White, like, blank slate. I don't know. But yeah, very problematic in his approach, and perhaps a bit too much, too late. And yeah, then the mom, Alex Cox, just very... I mean, we get the background story that her husband has been, like, cheating on her, and it's their anniversary, and she doesn't want to see him anymore, and is, like, very upset by that. But then it just kind of seems like later on it's like that never happened, and she's just very detached from the daughter. And there's, like, you know, the scene where she loses the two phones and she's talking to the person, and just kind of off in her own world, her own bubble, and then, yeah, just leaves the children alone in a giant house with, like, no protocol for, oh, call me if you need anything or whatever. Also, did she get into the car with an alcoholic drink, or was, like, is it water? I was trying to figure that out, because I was like, irresponsible. But I guess that's coding her as an alcoholic.
Yeah.
She is going to a 12-step meeting. Yeah, just the adults in this film kind of suck, because she's talking to Taryn Manning, you know, who's from Orange is the New Black, and this friend or whatever is like, you're doing a good job, blah, 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 and sees the confrontation between Dr. White and Alex Cox, and is just like, he's crazy, you're fine, you're doing the right thing, and it's just like, you are all mental, and letting these little 12-year-olds run wild, and they're gonna face the ultimate repercussions because no one has been there to give them a slap on the wrist or tell them how to behave as functioning and decent human beings. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is, like, exactly what you've said. This film is trying to blame technology and social media for quote unquote ruining the girls, but actually there's a lot of learned behavior from the parents, or the absence of parents, that we see.
Yeah, because isn't it like the last scene of the movie when it gets, you know, cut to Kat's incel video? Like, the mom just hands an iPad to her kid. Does that happen in this film, or am I just imagining that?
No, I don't think it happens in this film.
Okay, so never mind. Because there is that, just, you know, you see it in the wild, in the world, where parents don't want to deal with their toddler or baby, so they just hand them their phone or their iPad and let them, just the screen raise them. And if there is something like this, the app, I don't even know what it's called in this film, that I guess it's like dark web and encourages horrendous behavior. I didn't get the app. Was I missing something? Like, it made no sense to me.
Well, this is the thing that I kind of both really like. and find really hokey about this film is that it really tries to like double down on this idea like social media is evil and social media is a playground for cyberbullying, and it's wearing in our young teenage girls. But it kind of goes over the top with the app. Like, it is so extreme. All the pop-ups, all the colors, all the like, it's essentially like this vision of what an internet aesthetic is, but from someone who clearly has a very strong aesthetic themselves, is an artist, but is approaching this from the outside. So it's like being inundated and assaulted by this just pop-up screens and colors and a bubble gum style text that have nothing to do with the way that the internet actually and social media actually presents itself. So it's a little bit kind of bubblegummy Black Mirror vibes, which I find very interesting. And that's kind of part of as well the kind of the mom-like hokiness of it. I was like, yeah, okay, that's not how it works, but I can see what you're going for. It's like a very distinct vision of social media that's not based on any platform. Yeah. And the way that like images pop up and the way the hashtags are used, you know, even the title of the film, kind of hashtag horror, is so on the nose. And even the way that like I want to talk about the ending, because that's where Kat, who does kill everyone and then again commits suicide, much like in Unfriended, she sort of has a sort of a direct to camera address in the vein of like Elliot Rodger, who did that same thing and kind of posted a very lengthy video to YouTube before he committed his spree killings. It's exactly that vibe. It's like the internet is there to make us famous, so I want to be famous, and I'm going to be famous by committing violence. And the internet is to blame for me being this way, but also it's going to give me what I want, even if I'm not there to enjoy it. And that I find very over the top in the way that it's also presented, like very 90s with all the floating windows and the hashtags and the video of Kat talking to camera, and everything is made up. Like all the interfaces are only existing in this film. They don't exist anywhere else.
Yeah. It was just a very... The end felt kind of abrupt to me, too. It was just like, oh, it's been Kat. She's been on a murder rampage. And I was just like, okay, how? Don't get it. But, yeah, the end where she's going to be remembered forever, and that kind of twisted logic. Did you notice that there is in like all the screen, you know, like little interfaces at the end, that Slender Man appears in a few of them?
No, I didn't. Did he?
Just really briefly, yeah.
Oh my god, well that ties it. Like, that's probably one of the few things that kind of dates it in a way, because the blessing of using fake film specific social media that's created for the film only is that it doesn't belong to any particular era.
Yeah. I mean, or at least it looked like it to me. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Going back just briefly to the like the app and the vomit of color and everything that it is. And it's kind of, you know, mom aesthetic. It just reminds me a lot of, I speak to one of my grandmothers on Instagram. And, you know, a lot of my stories that I post are so that she can kind of see me living my life in the UK and everything. And man, she fucking loves her emojis. And I mean, I love my emojis, but I think that it's like that kind of age barrier where parents and grandparents think that we use them in ways that we don't, and more than we do. And yeah, so I just, when you were like mentioning that, I was kind of like, yeah, it's like acid grandma aesthetic or something. I don't know.
Acid grandma aesthetic.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that.
You didn't think those words were going to come out of my mouth, especially not in a film about teenage girls.
No,
yeah,
but
welcome to my brain.
I think it perfectly describes the aesthetic of this film, of #horror.
Yeah. I don't know. I wanted to like it a lot more than I did, to be quite honest. When I was watching it, it gave me a lot of it reminded me a lot watching it. I'm gonna assume you've seen it. The film Final Girl with Abigail Breslin.
Oh, yes.
Which is, if you don't mind me saying, horrible. Like, I think it's so bad.
Yeah.
I think it's so bad. And this kind of gave me, recollections or flashbacks to that, but done better.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of that, too, is the message that's trying to be told. Like, Final Girl is so on the nose. I mean, it was like, this is the definition of a final girl. This is X, Y, and Z. This is the math of it, you know? And I feel like it's kind of like, she has, the director, Tara Subkoff, has the parts and everything, but not quite the understanding or, like, the approach that makes it that next step. And I do think that Unfriended was a bit more successful in that, but also neither of these have been as successful, in my opinion, as, like, Host. And maybe that's also just the time between them, you know, like a decade, 5+ years, whatnot. But then again, like, Host was also a low-budget film that was made in the first, 10 weeks of the pandemic. So, like, very limited resources.
I think there's the massive difference as well is that Host was made by people who understood and used the Zoom, like the technology that is used as the narrative vehicle, like the setting of the film. Whereas you can definitely feel the generational distance between the filmmakers of both Unfriended and #horror.
Which is just kind of interesting to, like, think, because you'll definitely have generational gaps in other films that are being made, you know, even all the way back to the, you know, quintessential classics of the 70s. But it doesn't feel as jarring. There's something with the technology that adds, like, a larger gap of, or, like, a larger possibility of disconnect between message and film and overall feel or vibe, if you will. But yeah, no, they've been fun to think about and talk about for sure. Like, would never have seen #horror without this.
And to bring them both together, really, across both of those films, how do you think they use technology and social media to create horror?
Well, I think that, so with Unfriended, I think that's a bit easier to answer, just because you have the literal ghost in the machine creating the horror and the kind of mystery around it, and who is it / whodunit-y kind of aspect of that, and the being constantly watched, like, can't leave or they'll die sort of thing. But I think that in #horror, the use of technology and then the lack or the absence of the technology, right? Like, once they strip themselves of their phones and lock them away in the vault, that the absence of that technology just reveals how damaging the technology is, and how, you know, horrifying it can be to interact with other people and, like, be yourself. But then also with #horror, there's the kind of constant, outsider looking in and recording you and like that feeling of you're always being watched, again, like in Unfriended, but in a different way, and like that can be used against you because of the weird app that they use, that cats like stalking them and then posting about them on it, and they're just unaware.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really fucking creepy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like right now there's a lot of things I've been seeing on like Instagram and TikTok where, you know, people will record other people walking their dogs or something as in their car as they drive by or something, and it's like they have not given you that consent to do that. Like, why do you think that's okay? So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It does.
Sorry if it didn't.
And Megan, before we wrap up, is there anything about either one of these films that you wanted to mention that we haven't covered?
Let me give a quick think and pull up my notes that I took and see if that is there anywhere. Let's see, I made my final girl note. I liked in the very like blatant use of the blood into the pool in #horror that is very much of like The Shining. You know, I was like, oh, this is cool. And yeah, I also just like another weird, like, is this like a psychological thing that's occurring in Sam's mind that kind of never manifests? But I just thought that was like really interesting. But yeah, other than that, I mean, there are films out there. I did really enjoy Unfriended though. Like, I would watch that again if it was on television. You kind of know what to expect, but you don't. And again, it gets points for being creative in the deaths. I mean, maybe I need to watch #horror again and like know what I'm getting into and not cringe from my 12-year-old self that was reliving certain aspects of like insecurities and things, which is definitely like very true. I think it did touch on that and kind of that, you know, as you were saying earlier, a big kind of arc of the film, or an argument of the film, I should say, is girls growing up too fast, right, because of social media. But also at that age, that's when I started becoming aware of like my body size. If I was like attractive, it's when I started wearing mascara to school sometimes. And so that's also very like just par for the course with that too. So I think that was it touched on that, and then, you know, was like, okay, we touched on it, now we'll give it acid grandma aesthetic and blow it out of proportion. But yeah, no, thank you so much for like suggesting them. They were a really interesting duo to have and to kind of watch and reflect on. And
they're certainly weird, but watching them back to back, it's kind of really interesting how the same approach to social media and the same approach to teenagers on social media and cyberbullying, which feels like such a dated term at this point, but was definitely all the thematic rage in the media and in horror movies around this time, how these two very disparate films took the same approach and presented. And it's interesting that both the villains in these films, both the villains and the victims are teenage, young girls.
Yeah. There's a vast, there's a disproportionate number of female characters to male characters, like if you break it down. And I mean, yeah, in #horror, you really only have Dr. White, who is like Madman Dad in it. And then, yeah, in Unfriended, you have just kind of like stereotypical teenage guys, right? You have like asshole Adam, nerd Ken, and then like too good to be true good boy Mitch. So they're kind of, not that they lack depth, but yeah, the women have, I think, more interesting stories to be told in these films, which it's nice to see. it's important, rather than just them being nothing but tits and ass and getting stabbed and then being moved on with in films.
No, they're doing the stabbing here, but via the medium of digital bullying.
Yeah. Shallow cuts, but lots of them.
Megan, thank you so much for your time and for your insight. And where can people find your work online?
Thank you. I don't have like a consistent platform or anything. I mean, I have some articles, and if you really wanted to read my previous master's dissertations are on academia. I did write a piece for the Final Girls film journal on rape revenge horror films and the desire for catharsis about a year ago, which was a joy to write, even though the subject's quite morbid. And other than that, just like book reviews. But if you want to see pictures of my cats or anything like that, or my walks through cemeteries, you can follow me on Instagram, which is under my name, at Megan_Allen_. You can also find me with the same name on Twitter. I don't tweet that much, but every once in a while I'll put like the links if I have anything coming out up there. And then you could also, if you just like love my dulcet tones and want to hear me ramble about other like random things more, my friend Elo and I do have like a project we started in the pandemic. It's a little tiny side podcast called Modern Medieval, the podcast, where we just talk about the intersections of the modern and the medieval in film, television, literature, etc. You can find that on most streaming platforms. So if you want to check that out, we've got about 50 episodes that kind of come out sporadically. And I think that's all the social media stuff. And feel free to, direct message me or anything if you want to get in contact for whatever reason. I am here just doing my PhD studies, so always happy to have little side projects to do.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.